how are we actually going to get to ground to understand if an entity that we're doing business with in China has any exposure to forced labor risk in the Uyghur region. And it's creating a huge amount of internal work for organizations to do that. And we really think this is a trend that's just going to continue.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're back for another show of Simply Trade, and we are going to have a good discussion today. But as we're going through this, I will say that, man, I know it's like a broken record, Lalo. I keep saying this. Man, I tell you, I am just amazed on the activity on LinkedIn for us. We do appreciate y'all reaching out to us and trying to connect with Lalo and myself, and as well as the show and all that. But anyway, it's as things are progressing, and as we're looking at this is a good time of the year for us. And so, Lalo, how are you doing, my friend?
Doing pretty good, and just keeping an eye as we approach the end of the year here, and everybody just going around crazy. Just seems like everyone has just decided to, thank goodness for us, right? I guess, but to spend some of their budget and trying to keep us busy and engaged, which is really good. Thank you all for your business as well. And but yeah, I mean, we're looking at hopefully starting 2024 here with a bunch of exciting, cool stuff. And by the way, I see you're donning your it's not a Stetson, is it? Or is it your Larry Mahan?
This is by Larry Mahan on I have today. So, folks, I had been running around early this morning before we got online. And so I had my hat on and I came running in. I set everything up, and so here I am, and I probably have hat hair underneath it because I've just
so it's too late to take it off.
So
you can't take it off.
Yeah, anymore. I'm just leaving it on. So if you get to you hear us, but if you want to see what this looks like, you can go to our the video portion with the YouTube and the
YouTube. Yeah, exactly. Go to our YouTube channel, and yeah. So my dad, I don't know if you knew this. My dad was he worked for Larry Mahan. He was a handcrafter. He made boots by hand for Larry Mahan back in the day, and his specialty was to, all those cool little fancy designs and strings and everything that go on the tube of the boot and on the just regular leather boots, not the fancy stuff. But so yeah, he used to design stuff like that and make all those real cool designs and everything. But anyway, he did that for Larry Mahan and Tony Lama. So anyway, just fun fact there. Yeah. But anyway, okay, but today's episode, Andy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all right. We are continuing in a series here, and excuse me, that time of year where I get choked up at times. Anyway, we are continuing a series here with some folks from Descartes, and with that, well, I say some folks, is a gentleman we've had on, Jackson Wood. Jackson is been extremely knowledgeable and a great guest on for our first one. This is our second in the series. So we're going to get talking about, like, basically, I guess, as we were saying off camera here, Jackson, is that, a little bit of regulatory affairs, a little bit of sourcing, a little bit of collaboration within a company, and kind of in today's world, how things have changed a little bit, and kind of with the change of the government's approach on identifying the, if you will, the bad folks to do business with in the industries and all of that. Would that be a good, fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so, and great to be back with you, Andy and Lalo, and all of your listeners. It was a lot of fun for our first conversation. So I'm happy to pick the ball up here and dig a little deeper on some of the concepts we explored in our initial episode. And so just to maybe set the stage for us a little bit, we ended our first conversation with this notion of, look, there's a lot of challenges that organizations are facing with respect to identifying risk across their global supply chains. And it's really impacting multiple different parts of the organization. It's not just something that trade compliance is accountable for. It's not just something strategic sourcing owns. It really is a new paradigm where organizations are having to think collectively and work in a collaborative fashion to try to address the regulatory challenges that they're facing, reputational risks and challenges that they're facing. And then the newest dimension is resiliency challenges. So are some of these businesses, sure, they're legal for us to work with, and yeah, they're not necessarily going to hurt our image and reputation, but if they're located in a floodplain that didn't used to exist, or they're dealing with some infrastructure challenges in their country, that business might not be able to serve you over the long term. So how are organizations trying to try to think about this more holistically? And it really is across those three dimensions of risk that I just talked about. But I think where we wanted to explore a little bit more today is, hey, regulatory risk, reputational risk, it's a bit of a blurry line sometimes, and it's becoming even more blurry now as government stakeholders from around the world are becoming a lot less prescriptive in how they identify third parties that are illegal or ill-advised to do business with. And so we touched on the UFLPA in the US in our last conversation, and how there's a partial list of entities based in China that the US government has said, we know these entities are dealing with forced labor in the Uyghur region, and we are going to preclude any U.S. businesses from importing goods from those entities. But the list is not exhaustive, and the regulations say it's not exhaustive. And so how does an organization now start to do its own due diligence? And this is a big shift over the past 20 years that I've been in the customs and the regulatory compliance space. For the longest time, entities or organizations would just say, hey, we'll look at all the government published lists that pertain to us. We'll screen all our third parties against those lists, and we'll be good to go. And unfortunately, policymakers are becoming a lot less prescriptive. And so I think it's creating due diligence challenges where organizations do need to work more collaboratively, as you said, Andy, to say, okay, what is our due diligence approach going to look like here? Right? Like, how are we actually going to get to ground to understand if an entity that we're doing business with in China has any exposure to forced labor risk in the Uyghur region? And it's creating a huge amount of internal work for organizations to do that. And we really think this is a trend that's just going to continue.
Well, I will say this, Jackson, this is let me stop for a second to address our audience for just a moment. Folks, if you're listening to this, especially if you are an executive, a middle management leader and whatnot, you need to be looking at what we're talking about and thinking of how to, maybe you might need to adjust or change your approach when you are vetting a new product to be, let's say, sold or added to your inventory of items to sell to clients, services and things of that nature. From a leadership perspective, you need to be looking at it from a standpoint of, all right, what changes? Because usually, as Jackson, as we were saying, you're going to have your purchasing. They're looking for bigger, better, faster, cheaper, whatever, as far as the cost of items. Your transportation logistics, they're just looking at, cycle times from point A to point B and all that. Compliance, is crossing the T's and dotting the I's. You have all these different things that are going on. You have your customer service folks that are, selling it. You've got your sales that are out there knocking doors. You've got all these different entities that are touching different elements of people, companies, and the products. But when it comes to vetting this, now I'm getting into, if you are in these departments, is you just said, we're talking about as far as collaborating now, government regulations are such that you need to have your purchasing or sourcing groups working with your compliance and working with your logistics and transportation and all that. That kind of effort does not just happen. It doesn't just say, well, what's going on? I'm looking at this or whatever. It needs to be an ongoing adjustment of day in and day out, procedures, processes, and things of that nature. And I guess as we're talking through this is that to do that, if you're going to be effective, the big question is, how do you implement something like that? Would that be a pretty good way to open this discussion up?
Yeah, I think so, Andy. And I'll share, I was speaking with one of our customers yesterday about this very topic, and it was a diverse group of stakeholders in the conversation. So we had our trade compliance team. We also had the information technology group. We had legal, we had operations, et cetera. And one of the stakeholders who worked in the risk management office was talking about how he's actually had to create an entire new SOP for sort of bespoke due diligence on potential third parties, right? So there's this essentially kind of clunky manual handoff process that happens where, okay, sourcing has identified what they believe to be exactly as you say, Andy, bigger, better, faster, cheaper. We think this is looking good. Trade compliance weighs in and say, okay, yeah, there's no particular regulatory restrictions that apply to the jurisdiction. The commodities involved are clean, et cetera. But now they're having this individual in the risk management office have to do manual research to try to understand the ownership structure of that organization, try to understand what their supply chain looks like. Okay, so who are their core tier one suppliers? Who are the tier one suppliers to their tier one suppliers? And it's essentially become a full-time job, manual job for this individual in risk management to be able to vet and at a high level. Like he's even saying, I don't have 100% confidence that the due diligence I'm doing here is actually going to tell us the whole story, because he's relying primarily on open source information, right? Like being able to read media in the jurisdiction in question, government filings in the jurisdiction in question. And those of us who've worked in international business for years know that it's not like every country isn't like the United States in terms of the information that's available, in terms of how companies are structured and who owns them and the type of work that they do with their stakeholders. So it's created a very significant internal operational burden for this additional level of due diligence to happen. It is collaborative and they're doing their level best to make it an effective approach. But you've got this person who now has practically got a new full-time job of trying to connect the dots on this next level of due diligence. And it's proving to be very challenging for them to scale up because, as I say, it's really one person who's kind of figured out how to do this on his own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and all right, so here's the scenario though, that when you're looking at trying to, shall we say, implement this, is that, as I was just saying, from a leadership perspective, would you recommend that you're talking to a client and whatnot, would you suggest that a high level executive pull in the department heads and sit down and talk through this a little bit, or do you think that they need to do some kind of industry council type thing where they're pulling people from different organizations? Or I mean, what do you recommend for the next step for somebody here?
Well, I think that it's a combination of those two approaches, Andy. And so, as we talked about in our first conversation, obviously the internal governance is a key element to set your organization up for success here. So whether it's the chief compliance officer, the chief legal officer, the CFO, et cetera, like someone who has the organization purview to be able to sort of make these conversations happen and holds people accountable to executing against what is determined to be the appropriate course of action. So I think that is a really important element of being able to tackle these challenges. But you also raise a good point, and we see this particularly in some of the industries that we work in that have been dealing with these challenges for a more extended period of time. So if we think about apparel organizations or retail organizations, footwear has had the spotlight on it in this type of thing for a long time. And there are a very significant number of mature industry-wide collaborative tables that have been trying to share best practices and lobby for appropriate supports from government for a number of years. And they've done really good work in terms of being able to educate the industry and create those learning forums where best practices can be shared and some of the challenges can be worked through in a collaborative way. But I think to sort of come back, Andy, as you're talking about, like, what's a leader to do? What's someone who's really been tasked with trying to figure this out at the organizational level? There are a lot of people, again, particularly if you're in some of those industries that have been dealing with this, you're not alone. There have been lots of learnings that have been developed and can be shared. I would say, though, that it's important to recognize that it's not going to necessarily be plug and play, right? So just because something has worked in one particular organization in one particular vertical, we can think about that from a principal perspective and say, hey, it's about aligned internal governance. It's about really tight relationships with our third-party partners, whether those are freight forwarders, customs brokers, any intermediaries that are helping enable our supply chain. Let's talk to our technology partners. So whether that's our ERP providers, whether that's our global trade management providers, our contract management providers, because one thing that I do think is perhaps a bit of an unexplored opportunity for success here is going to those established partners and saying, look, is there anything else that you can do here to help us address these challenges, right? And I think that's where we're getting brought into a lot of these conversations, is saying, look, we've been working with Descartes from a compliance perspective or a trade automation perspective for 15 years. What are you hearing from your customers? How are they addressing some of these challenges? And are there capabilities in your technology that we haven't explored that might be able to help us address this? And so I think that's perhaps the final piece of this is, it's not necessarily go out and find a new tool that's going to help you, whether it's with supply chain mapping, whether it's with enhanced due diligence. Let's start with the known quantity. Let's start with the technology that we're familiar with, that our people are trained on, that's provided by a partner we can trust and that we can rely on, and see if we can build on that rather than running off, spending a bunch of money, standing up a whole new solution or a whole new function, when in actual fact, you might be able to do a lot of good work with the tools that you already have at your disposal.
Well, excellent, excellent. So with that, though, as you're looking at, what about creating an incentive for these different entities to work together? Where would you, I know what I would suggest, but I mean, I'd like to hear from your perspective what how to get people bought into. Yeah, conceptually you go through it, but how would you, I guess, move people along to say, hey, I'm in purchasing. I need to be bought into what the compliance folks are looking at, or what logistics is looking at, or whatever. What do you recommend there?
Well, I think to the degree that it's possible, very senior leadership, whether it's the CEO, whether it's the chairperson of the board, whether it's some key leadership figure in the organization, puts a stake in the ground, either internally or, in best case scenario, externally, whether that's if they're a publicly traded organization, the CEO and the board say, we are committed to rooting out any forced labor risk in our supply chain. We are committed to establishing a transparent and sustainable supply chain. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we are successful. We're going to set very specific goals. We're going to be transparent with the public, with our customers, with our internal staff about the work that we're doing and the resources that we're allocating here. Obviously, aligned incentives are a key element in successful internal collaboration. So I'm not a compensation expert, but certainly anything that leadership can do to work with their people and culture or their human resource leadership team to say, hey, how are we going to make sure that we're incentivizing our people to work on this collaboratively, to prioritize it in the light of all of the other things that we're trying to do on a day-to-day basis? But I think the somewhat more straightforward thing are those stakes in the ground, like I say. And if you think about, there are a lot of companies that are putting their money where their mouth is on this, like very public statements of commitment from executive leaders, from governance leaders saying, we are absolutely committed to this. It's become a part of what their annual reports speak to. It has become a part of the metrics that the business reports on. If they are publicly traded, disclosures are becoming a much bigger thing. The SEC in the US has really started to make significant motions towards codifying in sustainability directives and the reporting obligations that publicly traded organizations are going to have to meet. So I think what a lot of smart companies are doing is getting out in front of this. And so the CEOs are recognizing that, hey, this is going to become a part of how I'm managed or how I'm evaluated in terms of how our organization is successful. And so I'd rather start figuring out how we're going to do this today before it's a legal requirement. And this is that, as we were talking about earlier, this is where that regulatory and reputational risk piece, where those lines really start to blur. And if we look back over the past 15 or 20 years, it was often the case where there would be negative news or there would be a perception of a particular entity, whether it was an international company or a government, where if there's smoke, there's fire. And the smoke would be, hey, look, there's an investigation that's been opened on this organization because they've been dumping pollution into local waterways, right? And so maybe regulations haven't caught up to them or lawmakers haven't caught up to them, but organizations that were proactive were able to see that canary in the coal mine and say, hey, we're going to have to start refactoring our supply chain to get away from the risk that we're likely to be exposed to once this organization is officially reprimanded from a legal or a regulatory perspective. And so I think there's very similar trends happening now. I talked about the sort of direction the SEC is heading in the US, but there are new supply chain and transparency directives in the EU that are speaking to, okay, not only do you have to do this, you have to disclose on an annual basis what you are doing as an organization to address things like human trafficking, forced labor, sustainability, et cetera. And so to try to tie this back, Andy, to the internal collaboration, the internal work that has to happen, one of the things companies are going to have to do is say, here's how our strategic sourcing group has changed their standard operating procedures to bring a heightened level of due diligence into our sourcing activities. Here are the changes that our logistics and supply chain group have brought with respect to the functioning of our supply chain, how we think about moving goods from point A to point B. Here's how our legal and regulatory affairs group has changed the way they work with stakeholders internally to start bringing more transparency and more accountability to our global supply chain. And so I think it is in every organization's best interest to get out in front of this. It's only a matter of time until the legal burden is going to become such that it's no longer negotiable. So better to start learning and start building the cultural change that your organization is going to have to navigate through so that you're ready when it inevitably becomes something that regulations compel your organization to do.
Well, folks, I got to say, we can keep talking because we're getting into some really interesting things. But basically, on this, hopefully, this discussion has stimulated your brain to think through this. If you are a high-level executive, an owner, a small business owner, doesn't matter. On that, look at the approach on how, again, as simplistic as it is, vetting new suppliers, vetting new products, vetting even your customers of people you're doing business with, how the goods are coming in and who you're doing, who your vendors are, to the point of, again, talking internally and pulling people together and using the compliance as a resource and whatnot. And out of all of that, this is one of those things that I am looking, Jackson, I'm going to tell you, I think the next go round, we've talked about things in the past at a higher level. This is one of those who's like, literally, how do you apply automation, if you will, in the process, or technology into the process to automate processes that will make you more effective, keep you compliant, show you where the red flags are, and basically enable you to say, I got to take some action. I got to make a policy change. I got to do something here to make sure we're fine, or, hey, we're in good shape. Let's continue on. But it's not a one-shot deal either. It's got to be an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Jackson, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Lalo, I guess we've come to the end of another good show here, and I really am looking forward to the next series on this one. This is a good series.
Thank you, Jackson. I know this is building up towards, just different areas that we need to look at, and I really have been enjoying this a lot as well. So thank you all, and we hope our audience also has, like you say, Andy, gets a little nugget out of this, and and we can, we can hear from you, and you let us know. We need to come up with a way to better communicate with our audience, I guess, outside of LinkedIn.
Oh, I wish there's a little bit more interactive at times. Yeah, it's like maybe we need to do some more live webinar type podcast or something.
Yeah. We might come up with something like that. But anyway, well, thank you though. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to the next episode.
Folks, have a great day, and until next time, take care.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.